So, as you may or may not know, and spoilers for Elbab, but in chapter 1179, we finally get to see a face of Nerona Emu, the founder of the world government and one of the original 20 kings, correct? Alright, so I have said in multiple videos what I think their fruit is, and actually we called this over a year ago, but I do believe they have a devil fruit, meaning a devil fruit that actually turns them into a devil. However, I think it's a very specific devil in question. So I think the actual name of their fruit might just be the Bat fruit mythical model BAPHOMET. So the BAPHOMET is not really a demonic figure onto itself. It's not a literal devil. It's more of a symbol of occult esotericism that's supposed to represent perfect equilibrium. Its illustration, of which we're going to be talking about today, was established by Eliphas Levi, whom was an esotericist, writer, and poet, and made this illustration in his work called The Dogma and Ritual of High Magic. So the illustration in question depicts a goat-headed figure with the body of a human wearing what appears to be trousers. Not really sure. It has a pentagram in the middle of its forehead and has a weird headdress. The figure is also winged. Now, when we compare this to what we see of Nerona Emu's hybrid state, Nerona Emu is wearing very similar baggy pants to this illustration. Nerona Emu does not have wings. However, based on other videos I have made and other depictions of this same power, presumably, we know that Nerona Emu can grow wings. Nerona Emu is a horned figure like the BAPHOMET in question. Now, due to Nerona Emu having long hair, we do not see their forehead in this state. However, based on their relationship with pentagrams and how they use these magic circles for teleportation, I would think, much like the illustration of the BAPHOMET, they too have a star in the middle of their forehead. But to continue, the BAPHOMET in question is also said to be hermaphroditic. And that is what leads me to something I've been alluding to in various videos and I've outright said in others. I do think the actual form of Nerona Emu is a woman, or at least is female biologically. I think at some point in the past, they perhaps did body swap with Nefertiri D. Lily, and technically is Nefertiri D. Lily through the help of some ancient op fruit user in the past, because we do know that the op fruit can swap the souls of individuals. And it's very peculiar that when talking to Law about the op fruit, Doflamingo mentions the eternal youth surgery and the soul swapping surgery are the two most acclaimed powers of the op fruit, which is quite interesting if you ask me. But to continue, so I think the main body of Nerona Emu is a female. However, possibly due to the BAPHOMET being hermaphroditic in nature, meaning that it has the parts of both male and female attached to it, perhaps in One Piece, the BAPHOMET is a male power. So no matter what you are, you become a male. This is very similar to an ability in another manga series called Dorohedoro, which in that series we have a female character who does become a devil and she does look male. I just wanted to point that out there because that is a very similar thing that I've seen in popular media. However, getting back to Emu, so I do think that in the hybrid state here, we're seeing a human face, but I think the actual full state of this ability does turn Nerona Emu into a goat. But in calling Nerona Emu a goat, it brings up some very interesting thoughts that might be foreshadowing, actually, because in One Piece when we've seen a goat. The most popular goat I think that we've ever seen is Sengoku's goat. Now, Sengoku's goat is quite interesting because it was around when Sengoku was actually talking about Rocks D. Zebek for the first time and giving out the various bounties of pirates long past, like Big Mom, Whitebeard, Roger, etc. But what's also quite interesting about Sengoku's goat is that it's always eating something throughout the series. We don't know if these are important documents or what, but it's always eating paper of some sort. But it's also on the cover of volume 25 alongside Blackbeard, Luffy, Shanks, and Buggy, all which of whom are Yonko in the present story. So that's quite interesting. Very interesting indeed. What's even more interesting is that when we first see Nerona Imu do anything in the story, they actually eat. Because when Sabo invades the throne room where Nefertiri Cobra is confronting the five elders alongside Imu and Sabo attacks, Nerona Imu eats the fire attack set off by Sabo. So I find it very interesting that the first power that we see Nerona Imu do is actually eat something. That's just weird, don't you think? So that strongly makes me think that Nerona Imu in their full form is a goat man of some sort. Now, with that being said, when you're talking about sheep, which aren't necessarily goats, but they're related to goats, we have some correlations between sheep and occult magic, because when Brook is patted away by Bartholomew Kuma, he ends up in a land that has occultists on it, and the occultists were trying to summon Satan, but instead they summon Brook. I mean, they don't really summon him, he just crashes through the roof and ends up in the middle of the circle. But anyway, the head occultist has a black sheep on his hat. And of course, the occultists in question are surrounding a giant magic circle. We now know that Imu uses magic circles in order to teleport around, as well as giving the power to teleport around to others who bear their various covenants. So, with that being said, I find it quite interesting as well that the first Straw Hat that Imu faces, even though it's through the possession of Gunko, is Brook. So that's quite interesting within itself. But taking it back to the BAPHOMET, another interesting parallel between the BAPHOMET and Imu, as the story goes, the Knights Templar, a military order of the Catholic faith that existed from 1118 to 1312, were accused of idolatry as they were found to be worshippers of Baphomet. So, taking that into consideration, maybe that's where the Holy Knights come from, because the Holy Knights technically are a very religious coded group in One Piece who do worship Imu like a deity and do take on the powers of Imu in the form of covenants that gives them their immortality and allows them to use the magic circles as a form of warp gate. So I could see the Knights Templar being the inspiration for the Holy Knights in One Piece, and I find that very interesting. But in going back to the illustration of the Baphomet, another very interesting element caught my eye and is basically the reason for this video. The illustration of the Baphomet shows it wearing this really weird headdress that seems to be a torch of some sort. However, I think this was reinterpreted into being a crown and could be the reason why the base form of Imu wears this super tall crown. It's not only a symbol of office, as Imu has declared themselves the king of the world, but it's also a callback to this illustration of the Baphomet, alluding to Imu's demonic nature. That is where I think that comes from. Now, in talking about the fruit itself, the reason why I think the fruit is the Bat fruit mythical model Baphomet is because even though Imu doesn't have bat wings in the state that we see them in chapter 1179, various possessions that Imu has performed throughout the arc of Elbaf have led to various characters spawning bat wings of some sort. So, seeing as how Imu spawns bat wings on those they possess, it would only make sense for them themselves to have bat wings in their full Zoan state. At least that's what I think. Now, with that being said, too, the interesting thing about the bat fruit family, as has been shown off in the franchise of One Piece, is that it has always had some weird demonic undertones attached to it, at least in terms of theme. Because when you look at the first canonical bat fruit user in the series, Stussy, whom is the first human clone in One Piece history and is the clone of Buckingham Stussy of the Rocks Pirates, she has the normal bat fruit, which is a Zoan fruit. It allows her to turn into a bat, presumably, and from what we have seen, she most likely is a vampire bat. However, in the way she transforms, she only grows bat wings on her back. And based on her sucking the blood of men, it makes her more akin to a succubus as opposed to a bat, even though she literally has the bat fruit. Thematically, she is being positioned to resemble a succubus. A succubus, in short, is a female demon from European folklore that uses its feminine wiles to seduce men in order to take their energy. So it's very funny that during the events of Egghead Island, Stussy only sucks the blood of men, namely Lucy and Kaku. But with that being said, what I'm saying is that the bat fruit in canon has always had weird demonic connotations to it. But in going back to Emu and the BAPHOMET, the interesting thing about the BAPHOMET is that it looks like it's wearing a belt, but that might actually be a reference to the staff of Asclepius. Asclepius is the Greek deity of medicine, healing, and rejuvenation. But if we take it back to One Piece, this could be a very, very good reason for a lot of the powers that Emu has, namely the ability to give out immortality, because in giving out immortality, the various characters who have the power of the Depths Covenant can come back together. They can rejuvenate their bodies like they're brand new. This could also be the reason why some members of Emu's court, namely Gunko, can stay in their 20s despite being a little over 80 years old or so. So that's why I think that power presumably comes from. Now, in addition, the reason why I think this is also a very good reference is because Emu, as we see them in chapter 1179, is carrying some sort of weird staff. And we have seen before when they possessed Gunko that Gunko was carrying a trident. So weapons are a part of the fruit in one way or another. So I do believe, based on what we have seen so far and based on how Emu is also able to affect other weapons of people they have possessed, it is very possible that this staff could bleed into them having the ability to just forge weapons on the spot. Because what's so weird about the depiction of Nerone Emu and their supposed hybrid state is that they have a Hagoromo cloud engulfing one of the ends of this staff. So maybe, much like, say, Nika, they can imagine whatever head they want to be on the end of this staff, and it just appears. That's what I think that cloud actually means. It too is a gateway into Emu's imagination, perhaps. Now, the funny part about all of this is that Emu might just turn out to be the dark version of Eniru, because Eniru could too shape his staff into any shape that he desired through the powers of the Rumble fruit. He too wore baggy pants, and he, like Emu, had a ring on his back. But even though his ring is obviously a reference to the Raijin, Emu's ring could be a combination of different things. So the first thing that comes to mind is that this could be a reference to the Oraphim, which is a type of angel often called in popular culture the biblically accurate angel, that is a bunch of intersecting rings that are covered in eyeballs with a big eyeball in the center. We have this type of language already in One Piece because we have the Lunarian hybrids that are also pacifistas called the Seraphim. So I could believe that this ring is a reference to the Oraphim. With that being said, too, it could also be a reference back to the illustration of Baphomet, as there are two moons in the illustration. So these two moons could have come together to make this ring on Emu. Or quite simply, it could just be a halo, because a halo takes a variety of different forms in many world religions, but it often is a disc of light behind the head. So maybe this is just referencing that. Very possible. But yes, with that being said, I do believe that the main body of Nerona Emu is a female biologically, and when we see their full Zoan state, they will look like a big winged goat creature. But with that being said, if you are enjoying the video so far, hit the like button, and if you want to see more from me, hit the subscribe button followed by that bell so you never miss a Polyp Works video. In addition, if you could, please hit the hype button because it really does help. And with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polyp Works.